I knew the second Wesley leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, like a man who thought the room and the world owed him submission, that something was coming, something venomous and smug, but even I wasn't prepared for how stupid it would be. "You're off the project until you publicly apologize to my son," he said, soft and measured, like he was doing me a favor. His voice echoed off the glass walls, smooth and hollow, like it had been rehearsed. He tapped a folder of printed code reviews with a Mont Blanc pen, like a judge tapping a gavel. My eyes flicked down at the folder. I recognized the top sheet immediately. My red lines. Logan's module was a disaster, unvalidated, structurally reckless, and non-compliant with both our internal guidelines and the defense contract's security audit thresholds. I had flagged it 3 times, escalated it twice. No response. Just Logan strolling around like a Stanford dropout turned messiah, flashing that prep school grin like he invented gravity. I didn't speak, didn't blink. I reached for my backpack, slid it over my shoulder, and walked out of the conference room. Not a word. Let them interpret it however they wanted. Petulant, defeated, uncooperative. I didn't care, because while they were busy flexing nepotism, I was already thinking about the folder in my drawer. Quick pause. If you're listening to this, chances are you're one of the 97% who haven't subscribed yet. It means a lot when you hit that button and give a like. It keeps stories like this coming and really motivates the team. Thanks for being part of this. I left my badge on the desk, not out of drama, just protocol. No sudden moves, no confrontation. They wanted the performance of power. I let them have their theater. But that folder? That was mine. I slid it into my bag without fanfare, just 2 fingers and a flick of the wrist. Outside, I walked past HR without even pretending to stop. No exit interview. No sad little meeting about career realignment opportunities. I knew how this game worked. I helped to build the rules, remember? The irony was hard to miss. 15 years I gave them. 15. I was there before we had real funding, before the Series A press tour, before Wesley himself even showed up with his venture shiny teeth and buzzword bloat. I remember configuring the very first compliance schema on a folding table next to the vending machine. I wrote the initial IP contribution framework in a Google Doc over Takeout. And most importantly, I embedded the scheduler's signatory logic into a modular trust anchor bound under Clause 14b of the development charter, drafted, signed, and time-stamped. And guess what? That clause still named one person. Just one. Me. But of course, no one had touched that document in years. Wesley was too busy marketing our company like we were some biotech space hybrid ready for IPO. Logan certainly didn't know what a trust anchor even was. He barely knew the difference between a git pull and a merge conflict. But he was young, confident, related, and that apparently was all it took. They thought I'd slink off, mope in silence, maybe fire off a bitter LinkedIn post or leak a few details to a tech blog and hope someone in legal sent a threatening letter. That's what people do when they're pushed out, right? But I don't operate like people. Back at my apartment, I locked the door, poured coffee that had gone cold, and opened the battered black notebook I kept hidden behind my modem. I hadn't touched it in years, but the page fell open right where I needed it. The private key ID for the scheduler trust anchor. Still valid, still immutable, still mine. They didn't revoke it because they didn't know it existed. I stared at the line of code I'd handwritten back in 2011 and smiled. They had just pulled the only authorized signatory off a $220 million DoD deployment to protect someone who couldn't deploy a linter without help. And now they had a platform running on uncommitted code, missing a runtime validator, and a trust chain pointing to a key that was about to vanish. And not because I was bitter, because I had standards. I opened my laptop and began to type. Not an email, not a letter, just a quiet little script. Something elegant, something final. 15 years. That number kept looping in my head as I sat at my kitchen table, the city humming faintly through the window like it always had. 15 years of arrivals before sunrise and departures after the cleaning crew. 15 years of being the one they called when the system hiccuped at 2:14 a.m. and the one they forgot to credit when it stabilized by morning. I was there before we even had HR. Before we had funding, before Wesley Ford was installed by the board like a software update they thought would magically fix everything that scared investors. Back then, Phaeton lived in a crumbling rental unit in Palo Alto with ducts that rattled like nervous teeth and internet that dropped every time someone microwaved leftovers. There were 5 of us, 5 chairs that never matched. One whiteboard that was permanently stained blue. I handled compliance because no one else understood it and no one else wanted it. I wrote the first grant language at 2 in the morning because the deadline shifted without warning. I stitched together the earliest security model from government PDFs and coffee-fueled paranoia. And buried inside all of that, quietly and deliberately, I defined the IP chain of ownership structure. Not because I was power hungry, because I had seen what happened when founders broke apart. Because I had watched other teams lose everything the second one charismatic executive got bored or greedy. Because systems without constraints rot from the inside out. Clause 14b was my insurance policy against amnesia. It bound all scheduler modules to a signatory key held in trust, not in someone's title, not in someone's prestige. In a cryptographic anchor that required real authority, not borrowed confidence. At the time, nobody questioned it. We were too busy surviving, too tired, too hungry. Wesley hadn't arrived yet with his tailored suits and pitch deck grin. There was no sun to protect, there was just work. I flipped open the old black notebook I kept at home, the one I'd never digitized because some things deserved to stay analog. The spine cracked faintly in protest, and there it was exactly where I'd left it, written in my steady, younger handwriting. The key ID, signed by the original board. Logged, time-stamped, immutable. My fingerprint still lived inside the math of it. My name still lived inside the legal binding of it. They had forgotten, or worse, they had never bothered to read it. I leaned back and let the weight of that settle into my shoulders. It wasn't triumph, not yet. It was recognition. The quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need witnesses to be real. They were walking around in a structure I helped architect, cutting me out of meetings like I was dead weight, while the very spine of their flagship system still answered to a version of me frozen in time. I thought about Logan's override module again. The way he'd pitched it with that bright, empty enthusiasm. The way he'd waved off the risk like gravity was optional if you believed hard enough. He didn't understand the scheduler wasn't just code. It was a contract with physics, with latency, with failure. It controlled how signals rerouted under stress, how satellites chose survival over pride. You rushed that. You didn't just break software. You blinded systems that had to work when people were depending on them. And now they'd taken my chair at the table away because I refused to clap for him. I traced a finger over the notebook page and closed it gently. Whatever story they were telling themselves inside Phaeton, that I was difficult, outdated, overly rigid, that story could keep running for now. Let them tidy it into an exit narrative and share it in their Slack channels. Let Wesley believe he'd asserted authority. Let Logan believe he'd won. The truth was quieter. The truth was that they were building their future on a lock they no longer controlled. And I was the only one in the room who still remembered where the key lived. I didn't leave a note. No goodbye lunch, no dramatic handoff or final Slack message about next chapters. I let them believe what they wanted, that I was too proud to say sorry, that I packed up in shame, that maybe I'd been more fragile than they thought. It didn't matter. What they saw was an empty desk. What they didn't see, what they never saw, was how many threads still ran through my hands. Before I ever walked out that conference room, I already knew how this would unfold. Wesley wanted his son protected, the board wanted optics cleaned, and the dev team wanted someone else to blame when things went sideways. So I gave them exactly what they were asking for. Silence. But behind that silence, I still had access. A dusty contractor credential buried in the IAM matrix no one had updated since we transitioned to Zero Trust 6 months ago. It still had runtime log access, not deployment rights. Those were tied to my revoked badge. But the back end? That still answered to me like muscle memory. So I used it. From the guest Wi-Fi of a library 2 neighborhoods over, I logged in just long enough to initiate a full security integrity scan of the scheduler core. Not to change anything, just to watch, just to verify. I pulled the final hash set, the digital fingerprint of the code in its last stable form, with my signature still burned into the compile logs. That snapshot would matter soon. Then came the real step. I opened the revocation protocol I'd written for Clause 14b years ago and had only tested twice in live scenarios. The kind of protocol that needed a dual verification key, one digital, one physical, both of which I still held. One locked in my notebook, one memorized and embedded in a shell script disguised as an old configuration backup. I ran it. In less than 4 seconds, the trust anchor bound to my identity was voided, not deleted, just orphaned. And because Clause 14b was immutable, because that structure was baked into the DNA of our compliance architecture, no new signatory could be added unless authorized by the last valid key. And mine was now dead by my own hand. The system would still run. It would pass smoke tests. Regression would hold. Logan could parade it in demos, show pretty graphs, talk about throughput optimization and AI-enhanced load balancing. But when the moment came, when it was time to push final deployment to the defense uplink and actually go live, nothing would move. The scheduler would stall. The compile would fail. The platform would sit there like a locked door waiting for a key that no longer existed. I emailed a copy of the revocation confirmation to myself, encrypted and timestamped, then deleted my local access credentials and wiped the shell history clean. They thought I was gone. I wasn't. I didn't rage. I didn't leak anything. I didn't call in favors or post cryptic messages about knowing too much. I just waited, the way I always had. Watching from the edges, listening to the machine hum. People like Wesley think silence means weakness. People like Logan think absence means irrelevance. But silence, when chosen, is a scalpel. And absence? Sometimes it's just the sound of someone stepping into position. I close my laptop, push the folder back under the floorboard in my closet, and watch the late afternoon light move across the walls like a countdown. I knew the architecture better than anyone. I knew how long it would take before the holes started showing, and I knew exactly who they'd come looking for when they realized the entire system was humming on borrowed signatures. It wasn't abandonment, it was the beginning of extraction. Clean. Precise. Like a surgeon removing herself from the patient before anyone realizes the heartbeat's gone. Logan took the reins like it was owed to him, not earned, not requested, just assumed. The day after I left, he showed up in a fresh quarter zip and sneakers that looked like they'd never touched pavement, coffee in one hand, fake humility in the other. He called an all-hands realignment session and told the dev team how excited he was to drive us into this next chapter. I heard about it through a friend still on the inside, who sent me a screenshot with the caption, "You missed poetry hour." Then came the wired piece. 2 full pages of Wesley grinning in black and white, seated beside Logan like a proud monarch beside his freshly anointed heir. The headline made me snort into my tea. Inside Phaeton's quantum future, next-gen leadership, and the algorithm to change defense forever. Wesley spun the narrative like a pro. Talked about legacy systems and new thinking, how innovation needs fearlessness, how Logan was already rewriting what we thought we knew. No mention of the compliance stack, no mention of the signatory trust anchor, no mention of me. I kept the article, not out of sentiment, but for the poetic irony it would eventually become. Back at Phaeton, the satellite contract entered its final readiness review phase. The DoD team was starting to ask for final deployment verification windows. Everything needed to be aligned, platform stress tested, scheduler compiled, runtime sequence signed off. And from the outside, everything looked like it was on track. Logan hosted check-ins with his sleeves rolled up, tossing around words like agile and quantum resilient. The company's internal newsletter featured a banner with his face and a quote, "We're not just building systems, we're building what comes next." The tension was hidden like cracked glass under polished floors. People stepped carefully without realizing why. Then, on a random Tuesday morning, the illusion began to bend. A single Slack message from a junior backend dev, probably thinking out loud in a thread that had gotten too quiet. "Hey, anyone know why the scheduler's not finalizing deployment hashes? Build's fine, but hash validation keeps failing." No reply. Not from Logan, not from Wesley, not from compliance, and definitely not from legal. I was still looped into that channel, some forgotten role-based access artifact. I read the message once, twice, 3 times. The scheduler wasn't finalizing deployment hashes, which meant the revocation was holding, which meant Logan, in all his next-gen brilliance, had no idea the system he was showcasing was 1 signature short of dead weight. I didn't reply. I just closed the thread and leaned back, listening to the soft tick of my wall clock like it was counting someone else's breath. 2 days later, a letter arrived via USPS. Phaeton Systems letterhead, no return name, inside, a templated termination confirmation. Not even printed on cardstock, just cheap office stock, one-sided. No severance, no thank you, no acknowledgement of my years of service. Just legalese about the separation of roles and intellectual contribution waivers. I smiled, dropped it in the shredder with the same hand that had once carried their platform through its first federal compliance audit. Because at this point, it wasn't about gratitude. It was about what they'd built on top of me without realizing I was still the foundation, and I had removed the last nail holding it together. Outwardly, the company marched on. LinkedIn announcements, internal excitement, stakeholders smiling through teeth. But beneath it, beneath the PR polish and bright-eyed promises, something quiet had cracked. The scheduler was stuck, and none of them knew why. They thought the silence meant safety. But silence can also mean the system's waiting, watching, listening for the right moment to decide whether to move or not at all. Tuesday started quiet, too quiet, for a company standing on the edge of a $220 million defense deployment. The final DoD readiness window had been confirmed 2 days prior. Phaeton's internal dashboard showed green across the board. Marketing was drafting their celebratory press release. Logan was scheduled to record a short video for the internal launch ceremony. A message from the architect, they were calling it. But inside the guts of the machine, something ticked. At 10:42 a.m., the program director from the Department of Defense sent what should have been a formality, a request to validate the signatory keychain for final release. Standard practice. The military didn't move unless every signature in the trust ladder lined up and cross-verified. Logan received it directly, his name now on all primary contacts, because of course, he was in charge. He didn't panic, just forwarded it to Dev, CC'd compliance, and added a thumbs-up emoji. The dev team opened the deployment schema and did what they always did, compiled the validator report. Then the report returned blank. Not in data, in authorization. The final deployment hash wouldn't generate because the runtime lock had no valid trust key. The only signature it recognized was orphaned. Invalid. Logan kicked it up to compliance. They ran the audit again. Same result. And that's when someone pulled the old architecture documentation, the original version. Before Wesley's optimization pass, back when I still had editorial control, they found the keychain schema. Clause 14b, Section 3. One primary signatory required, immutable, one name listed, mine. They checked the system timestamp on the revocation file. Sunday, 8:17 p.m. Revoked. Logan didn't say anything, not at first. Probably didn't understand what it meant. Probably thought someone could just swap in a new key like this was a Google Doc and not a hardened security framework tied to the NSA's own compliance registry. Legal was called. Legal read the clause twice, then once more out loud. Then they froze. Because clause 14b wasn't boilerplate. It was foundational. It couldn't be overridden without triggering a breach flag, not just internally, but contractually. And the DoD didn't tolerate oops. At 3:14 p.m., a courier arrived at Wesley's office. No fanfare, no urgency, just a slim gray envelope, hand-delivered, signature required. Inside, a notarized copy of Clause 14b bearing the original board's signatures, a certificate of revocation, signed, time-stamped, and accompanied by my original key signature ID, and a USB stick, encrypted, air-gapped, labeled only with a handwritten tag. Runtime lockout hash, scheduler chain. No return address, no message, just the quiet, clinical trail of someone who had once built everything they now stood on, and who had chosen, carefully, deliberately, and without a word, to withdraw her gravity. There was no explosion, no alarms, no shouting in hallways. But somewhere deep inside the walls of Phaeton, the lights flickered, not because something had failed, but because something that had once kept the light steady was gone. Wednesday dawned like any other milestone day. Team breakfast, exec chatter, buzzwords echoing off glass walls. The press embargo was scheduled to lift at noon. Internal calendars were blocked off for the strategic readiness sync. Cameras were being set up for the live deployment showcase. Logan was already suited up, mic'd up, shaking hands and tossing out lines about quantum latency with that same performative gravity he mistook for technical depth. Wesley had his sleeves rolled just enough to look casual. Investors were dialed in. This was supposed to be their coronation. At 10 o'clock a.m. sharp, they hit the deploy button. Nothing happened. No error. No crash, just nothing. The build sat in queue like a dog waiting for a whistle that would never come. The log showed the same message over and over. Trust anchor not found. Signatory invalid or revoked. At first, no one panicked. They assumed it was a runtime permission issue, a bad merge, maybe an expired token. But the lead dev ran a deeper diagnostic and saw what I'd left behind, a phantom handshake trying to validate against a trust key that no longer existed. Wesley ordered the team to force push the deploy, use an override flag, strip the validator. The room went quiet. The dev lead spoke up, voice flat. There is no override flag. The signing requirement had been embedded at compile level, immutable. I had hardened it myself, per DoD protocol, years ago, when people still treated compliance like a spine, not a nuisance. Logan frowned. Can we spoof it? Just bypass the trust check? The CTO turned, slowly, like someone feeling a tremor beneath their feet and trying to decide if it's real. He asked one question. Who holds the trust anchor? No one answered. Legal was already on the move. One of their advisors had been scanning the Clause 14b revocation documents again, trying to find a loophole. They hadn't found one. Instead, they found the timestamp from the original board certification and the audit trail confirming that the trust anchor was solely assigned to me, and that the revocation had been initiated using the proper dual key method, which made it cryptographically and legally binding. No do-overs, no hot swaps, no patching it in post. Legal burst into Wesley's office minutes later, breathless and pale, a printout trembling in their hand. Sir, tell me you didn't fire the only authorized signer on the project. Wesley didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His face turned to stone, that careful mask of executive control hardening into something more desperate. His eyes flicked to the USB still on his desk, the one from the courier. He hadn't opened it yet, because deep down, maybe he already knew. The CTO stepped back. Dev leads started checking their phones, trying not to look at each other. HR was whispering in corners, eyes darting toward Slack channels that had gone eerily quiet. Somewhere, in a boardroom a floor above, an investor's assistant was reading the readiness delay report out loud. Somewhere, in a Defense Department inbox, the phrase contractual trust anchor breach had just been flagged by a compliance bot. The air inside Phaeton shifted, not loudly, not all at once, just enough for everyone to feel the walls tilt, ever so slightly, and still, I hadn't said a word. The first message came in at 6:12 a.m., a short email from Logan, riddled with desperation, thinly veiled as charm. Hey, saw some weird stuff on the deployment validator. Quick question when you have a sec. I archived it without opening. By 7:08, there were 3 missed calls from an unlisted number I knew belonged to Wesley's executive assistant, then another from legal, then a LinkedIn message from one of the senior devs, the one who used to roll his eyes when I flagged security issues that didn't match sprint velocity. By noon, they were trying everything, old college contacts, shared signal threads from hackathons past, even a mutual friend from a long-defunct Slack group I hadn't used in years. A flood of just reaching out. Hope you're doing well. Need a quick chat when possible. I didn't answer. Not because I was angry, because I was finally in control. At 2:34 p.m., a quiet message arrived. This one wasn't from the scramble. It was from Nathan Calloway, a former board member, one of the originals, a man who remembered folding tables and busted routers and the week we slept in shifts to prep for the NSF inspection. He didn't grovel, didn't posture. His message was 5 words. We didn't know. Can we talk? I didn't reply. Not yet. The real shift came later that afternoon, when the DoD liaison sent a formal notice to Phaeton's contracts officer. One sentence burned into their system in all caps. Pending verification of trust chain by Friday, contract execution will be suspended and internal investigation will be initiated. That was the detonator. By Wednesday night, panic was blooming in every hallway. Finance was in meltdown. PR had gone silent. The board was pulled into emergency session, and the investor group, up to now cheerleading every word out of Wesley's mouth, was demanding clarity, accountability, and a resolution by close of business tomorrow. Shareholders wanted statements. The project partner consortium was asking whether alternate vendors were being evaluated. Wesley tried to play it down, of course, claimed there was an administrative delay and that the original systems architect had been contacted and was cooperating fully. A lie. I hadn't said a word. I was sitting on my balcony in Tahoe, high up where the pine air was clean and the noise didn't reach. The snow had started early, slow and soft, curling through the air like it didn't need permission to fall. I held a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold and listened to the sound of wind threading through branches. I didn't check my phone, didn't refresh email. I let the storm inside their walls gather speed without me. It was strange, in a way. After all those years spent trying to make the machine run, I was now the absence they couldn't compensate for. Because they could call every consultant, beg every contractor, scream at every dev. But the truth had already hardened into something immutable. My name was still the only one the system would accept. And it was the one name no one could now ignore. Not because I asked to be needed, but because they'd built the future on my code and buried the key in arrogance. Thursday morning, my phone rang. Not a text, not a forwarded email, a direct call. I stared at the screen for a full 10 seconds before picking up. No rush, no curiosity, just inevitability. The name read unknown, but I already knew. Wesley Ford, he said, like we were acquaintances running into each other at a farmer's market. Not the architect and executioner of my forced exile. His voice was calm, practiced. The sort of calm that only shows up when everything else is on fire. He didn't say hello, didn't ask how I was doing. He said, "What do you want?" That was it. No apology, no context, just the cold calculation of someone weighing disaster against dignity and realizing he no longer controlled either. I didn't hesitate. I had written the line 2 days ago and never edited a word. I sent it as a single text message. Public statement clearing my record. 1-year consulting retainer at my original equity multiple, and your son steps off the project. Or it dies. No niceties, no smiley face, just the clause they didn't know they had to read. He didn't reply, just left the message on read. Less than an hour later, legal sent an encrypted message, a formal acknowledgement of receipt and a brief internal memo. Contractual liability exceeds consulting retainer by a factor of 9. Recommend acceptance. At 3:02 p.m., I received the draft press release from corporate communications. It was sterile, carefully worded. No apology, of course, they never apologize, but there it was, plain and unambiguous. Following internal review, Phaeton Systems is proud to formally recognize my full name as the original architect of our compliance and deployment framework for the adaptive scheduler platform. We acknowledge her foundational contributions, without which the project would not exist. Logan's name didn't appear. Instead, in the internal memo buried beneath the press draft, I saw the words, "Effective immediately, Logan Ford will transition to an internal innovation track focused on non-client-facing systems research," which meant shelf him quietly, let the noise die down. They didn't ask for a signature, didn't try to get me to sign a waiver or NDA. They didn't dare. I didn't send a counter. I just did one thing. I approved the key, pushed the signature through the validator using a fresh hash, authenticated, immutable, live. No commentary, no announcement. They would know it had worked only because the system, silent and stubborn for days, finally blinked green and moved. I shut the laptop. Outside, Tahoe was lit in amber. Snow had stopped. Birds were nesting in the pines. The quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was precise. Because this wasn't vengeance, this was leverage, timed to the second, executed with the same care I once gave to the code they tried to strip my name from. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't storm back in. I just wrote one sentence, sent it, and watched an empire flinch. The platform launched on a Monday. No delay, no glitch, no last-minute apology tour, just quiet execution. Exactly how I designed it. The deployment logs read clean, the chain of custody verified in milliseconds. DoD flagged it as green within 30 seconds of activation. Flawless. The internal email went out by 9:02 a.m. Phaeton successfully deploys adaptive quantum scheduler in final readiness window. I wasn't copied. But I didn't need to be. I scrolled down the credits page, past the executive team and the product leads and the PR blurbs written by people who hadn't written a single line of code. And there it was. Quiet, but undeniable. Strategic Architect Emeritus. My name, no fanfare, no top billing, but it was permanent. Stamped in the release archive, printed in the final contract submission to DoD, burned into the metadata of the versioned build. They couldn't erase me anymore. And they knew it. Wesley, I heard, took an extended sabbatical starting that Friday. The official language was about personal reflection and investing in the next generation. But the internal word was simpler. The board had made it clear. No more family favors. No more unchecked legacy passes. Logan was moved to a different floor. Innovation Sandbox, R&D, something something. They gave him a new title, one of those inflatable ones that sounds impressive and means nothing. I didn't ask what it was. I didn't care. At the post-launch reception, smaller than they'd planned, quieter than they'd wanted, I showed up unannounced. Not in a suit. Just a dark coat and boots still dusted with Tahoe snow. Some people recognized me and didn't know if they were supposed to say anything. Others didn't recognize me at all. The DoD director did. He crossed the room without hesitation, shook my hand firmly, looked me in the eye. "They said you vanished," he said, almost like a joke. "But I guess you were the only one who knew where the wires ran." I nodded. No need to correct him. He wasn't wrong. A few feet away, one of the junior devs glanced over and looked quickly away. The CTO avoided eye contact. Legal didn't show. I didn't stay long, didn't give a speech, didn't wait for the champagne toast or the awkward photos. I just walked the floor once, watched the monitors cycle through mission logs, watched the platform pulse in the background, steady and alive. Watched the thing I'd built run on the framework they tried to separate from me, and then I left. They didn't follow, didn't need to, because this was never about revenge. It was about clarity, about the difference between being seen and being remembered, about knowing when to speak and when to let the system speak for you. Funny. I didn't need to shout. I just had to unplug what I'd once built.